Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting where we will present the exhibition To Me Living as Christ, the Metropolitan Antonij of Sourozh. The will of Christ can be identified through the ones he chooses. This is the case for the experience of many people. A similar thing has been said in this very room for Abraham. And I believe that it is very important that we continue following the same ideas, because Metropolitan Antonij of Sourozh was chosen to show God's will even in a very complicated situation, in a situation where the Russian migrants had lost their country, their citizenship, and so they were at risk of losing their identity. And so today we meet here and we will see how the Metropolitan Antonij was a shepherd, a leader, a guide for all those who shared his situation, for all those who had lost everything just like he did. But we are also here today to understand that he was very important to help us grow and understand what God's will is. I don't want to take up too much time of our guests. And I would like to say that today's guests were extremely important for the creation of the exhibition we're presenting today. So I will now give them the floor. I will just introduce them very briefly. And this introduction will help us discuss the various aspects of this exhibition. And they will help us understand them so that we can have a more complex idea of this exhibition. So I first leave the floor to Mr. Aleksandr Filonenko. We were born more or less in the same years. He was a physician, so he had a scientific education, mainly. But through his encounter with Metropolitan Antonij of Sourozh, he then became a university professor in philosophy and theology. He's professor of philosophy and theology at the National University of Char'kov in Ukraine, but he also teaches in other universities in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. In 2012, he created a socio-cultural agency called EMOS, which promotes the integration in society of disabled and poor young people. And then in 2014, he also decided to create the Dante Center, which is a European cultural center, to bring testimonies of a new kind of experience in Ukraine. Our friend Aleksandr is the one who decided to create this exhibition, so I would like to ask him who Metropolitan Antonij of Sourozh was, and why did you decide to create the exhibition we will then be able to visit? Thank you.
Бог дал нам сегодня встретиться.
God has made it possible for us to meet today. This is how one of the sermons of Metropolitan Antonij of Sourozh starts. He went to the Soviet Union and held this speech. And we often say these words when we meet, but we rarely stop and think about their real meaning. And in these words, we can see his whole ideas about theology. He was a real theologian of the encounter. And I would like to tell you some of the words he used about the encounter. Encounter is always a joy, he used to say, because every encounter comes from God. Every encounter is the second in which people face each other, sometimes for a very short moment, but at the same time, also forever, because when we meet with an open heart, with faith, with charity, with a common hope, and in the same sign of a common cross, and with faith in the resurrection of Christ, which will come, we can never be separated from each other. The distance doesn't exist anymore. Metropolitan Antonij was born in 1914, and so basically he was born during the First World War, and for his whole life he dreamt about going back to his country where he had never been. And for the first time he managed to go back to his country in 1960 when he was already a bishop, and he was already a bishop in Great Britain. His parents were diplomats, and they had experienced the tragedy of the Russian Empire. So for us today, it is really hard to understand that terrible situation in Russia. And for me, something was very shocking, the fact that the modern Europe is going through a lot of difficulties which are linked with migration. And the number of migrants who come to Europe today are many millions. In the 20s in Europe, 3 millions of the former Russian Empire found themselves without a country. They had lost everything and they were not able to go back to their homes, to their own country. They were forbidden to go back to their country, otherwise they could be sentenced to death. So the generation of the parents of Metropolitan Anthony was the generation of people who had lost everything, anything you can imagine. So it is also the story of the discovery of a lack. And this generation was great because they were able to understand that this lack they felt was actually a beautiful gift they were given by God. It was, first of all, the gift of freedom. One of the most important saints and thinkers of this generation, Mother Mary Strotsev, used to say that the experience of freedom is a gift we were given by God, which we owe to the Church. The generation of their children, which is very well represented by Metropolitan Anthony, is the generation of people who had even lost the church itself. And so the Metropolitan used to say that once they had lost everything, once they had lost their country, their family, and their own selves, and even the church, considered as an institution linked with their country, they were able to discover a lack, and there were only two solutions to this lack: either death or the encounter with God. A God who is necessary for them. And so this is the very topic of today's event. Today's main idea is that only through an encounter with God can we eliminate this lack. And so the story of the Metropolitan Anthony is the story of a man who at the beginning was against the church. He was fighting against the church. And this hostility he felt was the hostility of a young boy. When he was 14, he met Christ. He understood that Christ could not only fulfill this lack he felt in his heart, he could help him discover the whole world. And so Metropolitan Anthony became a philosopher, a magician. He then moved to England. He became a priest, and he created a community. He became the leader of this community. He then even became the bishop of this religious community. He was a free voice of the church, which was persecuted at that time in the Soviet Union. And when he went to the Soviet Union, he was the free voice of that generation of Christians, of those saints who were born in Western Europe but had never lost their faith in Christ. When we started working at this exhibition, it was very important for us to start from the meeting. And I would like to tell you how our exhibition started. 4 years ago, for the first time, some Orthodox students had brought an exhibition here about Dostoevsky. And so the biggest result of this exhibition for us was probably that beautiful friendship which developed from that exhibition among Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Italians. And so it became clear to us that we had to understand better what our friendship was about. And we had to try and tell about our friendship to our friends. And so we started trusting each other, we started working with each other, and 1 year later in Rimini, we created an exhibition about the 20th century martyrs. We started joking and we would tell each other, a flying community is born, as we used to define it. And we used to say that that community should not only be present at the meeting, but it was important for us to understand how our friendship was rooted in Christ. And so the fact that we had this beautiful friendship was a sign of the love of Christ and of His mercy. Then, as you all know, for our country, the situation was very complicated, and to us, everything looked as if it was over, and our friendship was at risk of ending there. However, the fact that our friendship was rooted in Christ was the only thing which still enables us to live our lives to the fullest and to be witnesses of our friendship. Thanks to Metropolitan Anthony, we were able to meet, to work together, whether we were Catholics or Orthodox, whether we came from Russia, Belarus, and the United Kingdom, or Italy. And the most precious thing about this encounter was something that we didn't understand immediately. I would like to tell you about two things that happened to us. In 2014, last year, God made it possible for us to celebrate Easter together in our city, Char'kov. It is in eastern Ukraine. Those were terrible days. They were very complicated days because many friends of ours did not manage to come, and we were very scared because there was war. However, many of our friends managed to come, and for us that was a very important sign of friendship. Then we celebrated the Easter night, following the Orthodox tradition in a very small church in Kharkov. And during this long celebration, during the night, Franco Lebrini told us that he had just understood a very important thing, and he wanted to ask me a question. We went outside the church, and as you know, I don't speak Italian. He doesn't speak Russian, and so basically we use gestures to understand each other. And thanks to this speech, this dialogue we had, I understood that you can communicate important things even if you don't know the language that the person is speaking, because you can communicate with your hearts. He told me, "There's war. I don't understand anything about this war. But I am suffering because I see that there are tensions amongst my friends." And so I started wondering what we could do about it. He said, "I want to ask you something. Do you believe that Christ won and can win any war?" I told him, "Yes." "And so this means that Christ has already won this war as well," he said. "Is it true?" I said, "Yes, that's true." And so he told me, "Then we have to do something. If God will allow us to do it, all these friends coming from different countries have to meet with Christ, and they have to go there where Christ has already won." And one of the greatest miracles of our community is the fact that in Christmas last year, in Jerusalem, 180 people met, and we experienced together in Christ not only the pain, the suffering, but also this feeling of being grateful to God because we had recognized in our experience the peace of Christ, which is a gift He gave us. After that, we met once again, and we have talked about this meeting, and we have dreamt about this meeting for a long time. During the last few years, we have always felt that we were experiencing something very similar. The Orthodox people told with great joy about Metropolitan Antonij. For many generations, he was the symbol of the Orthodox tradition. And our Italian friends, of course, were telling about their experience of the encounter with Father Giussani. 1 week before the meeting with the Pope in Varigotti, we met once again, and I would like to tell you about that meeting. About 80 people met in Varigotti. They met in the place where everything started. we wanted to think about our experience, about the experience of Father Giussani and of the Metropolitan Antonij. There was a very joyful atmosphere. We were all happy because we recognized something which we had in common. And we wanted to share our joy. And we wanted to do this through this exhibition. I hope we managed to convey at least a bit of this joy. Thank you.
Grazie di cuore, Aleksandr.
This story hasn't ended yet. And as you can see, now we have another aspect of this story, and we're going to discover it. And now I leave the floor to Mr. Constantin Sigov. He was born in 1962. He's from Kiev, and he studied engineering. However, then he studied philosophy, and now he's a philosopher and a professor at the National University of Kiev-Mohyla in Ukraine. And he's also a lecturer in the Sorbonne University in Paris. He's also the director of the scientific association Buchi Litera, Soul and Books, which publishes books about philosophy and biology and of a wide cultural aspects. And he's also the director of the San Clemente Center in Kiev. It's a center which focuses on the dialogue with the Christians, and it follows the work of the Orthodox, of the Father Anthony. I would like to ask you, you had the chance to meet with Metropolitan Anthony, and your experience is a very rich experience which might be useful for the whole Europe. So can we say that Metropolitan Anthony is a gift for the whole Europe, for the Eastern and the Western Europe? Can we say that? What does his memory give us today? Publishing the books of Metropolitan Anthony in the Soviet Union was prohibited. So thanks to samizdat, we could read his books. And how could the Gospels and other prohibited books could come to the Soviet Union from the Western Europe? Father Romano Scalfi talked to us about it. A young person, an Italian woman, crossed the border through the Soviet Union. She pretended she was pregnant, but actually she was hiding a lot of books. So in the Soviet Union, we could read all those books. And it was like a rebirth for us, because those books which were prohibited were read. I was reading them together with my wife, and we were glad because it was a real help for our history. After the fall of the Soviet Union, we created Buchi Litera, and we started publishing the books of Metropolitan Anthony. I had met him right in 1988 in Moscow with other friends. He talked to us about his spiritual father, thanks to whom he had looked the face of God, the face of Christ in the face of another man. He had met another person in which he could see the glory of Christ. Metropolitan Anthony was talking about not only of the things that he was doing, he was a testimony, a living testimony with his own person. And I baptized after meeting him, and my family did it as well. So he really set us free from a series of barriers that were like an obstacle for us in order to meet the church. So he was the first priest, and I, I trusted him. I trusted this priest. It was the first time in my life. Of course, I didn't know the church. I read the gospel, but I didn't know it. There was an anti-clericalism that had been created for us. It had been created by the agents of KGB. It spreaded many voices, and people were afraid of church. They didn't want to confess. They didn't want to open their heart. But Metropolitan Antonij set us free from all of these barriers. I remember how he was holding the cross and he was giving his blessing to all the people around him. I remember his eyes. He was a man that with his eyes he had seen God, he had seen Christ, and with all his body he was conveying this. I was looking in his eyes the image of God, the image of the living Christ. Thanks to him I could taste infinity, I could taste endless space. So I was baptized, my wife Irina as well, and my son Aryosha as well. It was a gift, a real gift, a spiritual treasure, and today we want to share it with other people. We've been living in Paris for some time, and we started to think that it was necessary to publish one of the most important books of Metropolitan Antonij, which is entitled In the Name of the Father, of the Son, of the Holy Spirit, and it is a collection of his sermons. We went to Rome, and the bishop wrote something in this book for my wife, for Irina, and she created the new edition of this book, which was meant to spread in the space of the Soviet Union. And we did this because of the joy that we had when we had met with him. And it was very important to us that Metropolitan was called Anthony, because it's the same name of the person who had founded the first monastery of the Orthodox Church in Russia. And after his death, there was a meeting in Paris with a woman, Metropolitan, and this woman were very close, and because they had lived together in Paris during the Second World War, and in that moment, Anthony had completed university. He was a doctor in Paris, and a few years later, after the liberation, he went to London and he started working as a priest before and then as a bishop. Then he moved forever from France to London, and this shows us how his life had changed forever. We don't understand why he stopped being a doctor right in those important years. The doctor is a secret root of his entire life. We have a few data of Dr. Bloom's during the war. We don't know actually many things about him. In Paris, when I met this woman shows me 7 cards and 7 letters, and I could realize that he had a very significant voice, and this voice became the voice of our entire existence and of our generation. And for us, well, it was like that. It was like if Metropolitan Anthony was talking directly to us. He said, "I hope that you will be strong and you will be faithful. You need to have a golden heart. It has to be like a treasure. You need to cherish it. You don't have to use bad things. You don't have to get used to evil things in your life, even though you will see many evil things." And in a society in which there was the totalitarianism, so it was a really crazy society, that Dr. Bloom showed the terrible price of a fake joy, I know that sometimes when you are afraid and you are tired, well, and you feel powerless, you want to get out of that situation. However, we don't have to. We don't. Our heart must be always pure. Obviously, you don't have to kill your soul or sell your soul in order to be calm and have a peaceful life. This is a very high price. Ludmila Petranovska, a Russian psychologist, recently talked about the role of propaganda today in Russia, and this is like the novel by Stephen King where people get texts and they become zombies. It's like the virus of propaganda, which makes people becoming zombies. So when we talk to other people, we don't understand if he's a sane people or if he's a zombie. Dr. Bloom talks us about the solution in order to keep our hearts pure. This is something that cannot be done in a psychological or medical way. Love is what we need. A love for sick man, a compassion for man, and the real healing is represented by the path towards the presence of God in man's life. What is the link between the experience of the generation of Anthony and the generation of Father Giussani? After the Second World War, they took part in the reconstruction of Europe after the war. It was a new part of history in order to overcome the isolationism and the construction. They built bridges between Eastern and Western Europe. They created a new Europe. Many people did it. That woman as well, that woman who pretended to be pregnant and who brought us the books in our country. Today, our continent is facing a terrible crisis. After the annexion of Crimea and after the beginning of this new hybrid war, today a new question arises, a new question concerning the dignity of man, the separation between good and evil things. These questions are important and significant today of this new and third Europe. Is the new way of asking to be or not to be, and the first issue for the generation of the crisis here in Europe is to be free of a false neutrality. What does Metropolitan Anthony say? In the new Europe, there was this quotation: Are we testimonies of the fact that Jesus Christ is alive, that I am His, that He is here next to me, that He is my entire life, that He is the truth of my life, the only truth? Is this presence among people a real testimony? Is our presence a testimony of the presence of God? There is no third way, there is not another possibility. We should look into this problem properly, because by looking at it, we realize that either we are testimonies or we are not. There is no neutral position, there is no escape, there is no third solution. The choice that we have in front of us is either we testimony the lack of any meaning of life, or we testimony the fact that there is a meaning in life, there is no third escape, there is no other solution. And today we must be testimonies of one of the two solutions. In Syria, in Europe, there are the martyrs. The Greek word for martyr means testimony. It means witness. And the most important thing of the witness is not the blood, but is the endless love. And it was the same when the Christians were persecuted in the Romans. The most important thing was the love of those Christians, the love for man and for God. I just want to give you an example of Metropolitan Anthony. In 1923, Pietro Grado is arrested after a sermon, and he is tortured, he is beaten, and after a few months he was free. And after that period of prison, he is like devastated. And his parents and his relatives ask him, but what's left of you after these months? And he says, the sorrow and the pain has taken away everything. The only thing that I've left is love. So to conclude with, I want you to give you two examples of a deep unity and of the connections between the thought of Metropolitan Anthony and of Father Giussani. I will now give you two quotations, and I will ask you to guess who is the author of both quotations. Will it be Father Giussani or Metropolitan Anthony? I will not give you the answer. The first thought is something concerning Holy Father. The Father is someone who loves his children and who makes no compromises, and he wants us to do what we have to do in our life. He cherishes our dignity. The second quotation. This regards the fact that in a moment of crisis, in difficult moments in our lives, we need a witness, an alive witness that can say, don't be afraid. Look, everything that you're looking for is real. I can tell you that this is the truth. We are here in the world because we must be testimonies of these. But how can we do that if we are not aware of our faith? If we are not able to say to other people, look, I'm in the right path and I will show you which are the steps that you have to take in order to follow me. You need to think about these two quotations and you will have to guess who are the authors. you will find the solutions in the Nuova Europa, New Europe. So the fundamental question is, can our testimony be able to convey our education and the values that we have received? This depends on the live testimony of every one of us. This is the most important thing that we have to do every day, and here as well in Rimini.
Grazie Constantin anche per aver...
Thank you, Constantin, for sharing a dynamism, as I would define it, which hasn't ended yet. It is hard to understand something about Father Giussani and Metropolitan Antonij if you try and see them as fixed examples. Their experience is something which evolves and becomes a way for us to try and follow their steps, try and find a new path to follow. And through this process, we also change and evolve, and we are never the same for more than a second or a minute. We see that our process makes us change, and we can understand this not only through science, through history, not only by remembering facts, not only by looking through archives. We need something more, and that is why we have invited Mr. Dimitrij Strotsev. He was born in 1963, and he graduated in architecture. However, he then started to work as an editor. He is the main publisher of a magazine called Otri Nuovi. He mainly publishes poetry and literature about religion. But he is a poet himself. He writes in Russian. He is famous not only in Belarus, but also abroad. So the language of poetry, which he is an expert and which is also part of his life, will help us understand something more, not only about Metropolitan Antonij, but also about ourselves when we meet Metropolitan Antonij. He is also the director of a fund which promotes the diffusion of the inheritance of Metropolitan Antonij, of his activities. So I now give the floor to Mr. Strotsev for the third part of today's meeting. Good morning to all of you. Some days ago in Siena, where Mario Luzi spent his childhood, and as you know, a poem by Mario Luzi is the title of this year's meeting. What is this lack of, O heart, of which all of a sudden you are full? I was in Siena, as I was telling you, and I asked some of my friends of Communion and Liberation why the movement of Don Giussani focuses so much on poetry and on poems. And so my friend Massetti, Mr. Francesco Massetti, gave me a very particular answer. He said, because the whole movement of the church is a poem. And I asked him, what do you mean? So he went on and he said, Father Giussani says that in every movement he created, there can only be something new in poetry. And this is the very essence of poetry. In order to be poetry, poetry has to always give us something new. It has to change continuously. It has to surprise us continuously. And it has to reveal something new. And in the same way, Christ is a constant source of innovation. And so he sees his church, the Christians, as a new people, and he wants us to evolve, to be new. We always have to be able to be surprised, and we have to be ready to take new steps and to follow new directions. I would like to start my speech about Metropolitan Antonij by quoting a conversation I had with him on the 8th of June 2000. He said, I have a very clear, or rather gloomy feeling that as we enter the third millennium, we are entering some obscure and complex and in a certain sense unwelcome period. As for devotion to the Church, our faith must certainly retain its integrity, but we must not be afraid of thinking and expressing ourselves openly. Everything will eventually settle into order, but if we keep just endlessly reiterating what has been said long ago, more and more people will drift away from their faith. I mean, not so much Russia as the world as a whole. People will drift away from their faith not because everything that was said before is erroneous, but because the approach and language being used are all wrong. Today's people and the time they live in are different. Today we think differently. I believe one must become rooted in God and not be afraid of thinking and feeling freely. There are two moments in the life of Metropolitan Antonij which he used to tell in different situations. But I don't think he ever told about these two moments in the same moment. But to me, they are very closely linked. The first is about a Protestant minister. He was responsible for a whole region in England, and he met Metropolitan Antonij and asked him to accept his son in the Orthodox community. Metropolitan Antonij was quite surprised of this request, but the minister told him that his son was deaf. And he said that the Protestant religious rite was all based on words and sounds, and so his son couldn't understand anything. However, once his son had entered an Orthodox church and had told his father that he had stepped right into the New Testament because he could see and feel it all around him. So Metropolitan Antonij decided to meet this young boy, and after a certain period of preparation, he welcomed him in the Orthodox Church. And so this Protestant boy became a member of the Orthodox community. The second moment in Metropolitan Antonij's life is linked with the Greek Church in England. Once, when a bishop of the Greek Church was talking with Metropolitan Antonij, he told him, you know, it's a very nice thing that there are so young people in your parish. In our parish, there are fewer and fewer young people. Young people don't want to be with the old people, and so they have stopped coming to church. So Metropolitan Antonij told him, well, make them come to our church. They will meet young people. However, that bishop said, no, for us it is better if they stop going to church altogether, because otherwise they will be dead in the eyes of the Lord. these two examples show how you can have two different kinds of attitude. You can be open, or you can feel mistrust towards other people, towards everything you don't understand, everything that is different from you, towards different churches. Metropolitan Anthony had encountered Christ when he was a kid. He had become a Catholic in France, but then he decided to join the Orthodox community, and he was part of the poorest parish in Paris, poorest Orthodox parish. But it was the only community which was still faithful to the patriarchate in Russia. Most of the migrants had decided to leave that church because they believed it was too linked with the Soviet world. People used to say that the Orthodox Church was trying to make them change their opinion. Metropolitan Anthony felt that when he was in Paris, his life was quite hard. His mother wanted to send him to school. However, the school would have only accepted him if he had converted to Catholicism. The family of Metropolitan Anthony refused, of course. And this fact was a wound for Metropolitan Anthony. When he then became the parish of the Orthodox community in London, he said about the relationship between the Catholic Church that you can either be Christians or you can be Catholic. Later, however, he said that to him there was no other choice. If you wanted to be a true Christian, you could only be an Orthodox. This doesn't mean that he was completely against Catholicism, but I think we can understand the pain he felt for the Orthodox Church in exile, which risked extinction, as we could say. So you could either think about a church which was present in the whole world, or of a church which was about to disappear. During the years, Metropolitan Anthony wondered many times about the relationship between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church when he met representatives of the Orthodox and the Catholic world. There are many differences between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church in theology, differences of attitude. Many times, Metropolitan Anthony was asked what difference there was between the two churches. Even when he went to the Soviet Union, he was asked more or less the same kind of questions. And from his answers, we can understand what his main ideas were about the relationship between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. He used to say that we can be friends, we can cooperate with the Catholic Church, with laymen, with priests. He used to say that in times of war or in very difficult situations, we can help each other. We can be aware of the presence of Catholic saints, of the gifts of the Catholic Church. However, we cannot accept the policies of the Vatican, because one of the goals of the Vatican is that of basically eliminating the Orthodox Church. And so, what can we make of our desire for the unity between the two churches? I would like to read once again the quote I started with. I have a very clear, or rather gloomy, feeling that as we enter the third millennium, we are entering some obscure and complex and, in a certain sense, unwelcome period. As for devotion to the Church, our faith must certainly retain its integrity. But we must not be afraid of thinking and expressing ourselves openly. Everything will eventually settle into order, but if we keep just endlessly reiterating what has been said long ago, more and more people will drift away from their faith. I mean, not so much Russia as the world as a whole. Not because everything that was stated before is erroneous, but because the approach and language being used are all wrong. Today's people and the time they live in are different. Today we think differently. I believe one must become rooted in God and not be afraid of thinking and feeling freely. Freely does not imply free thinking or contempt for the past or for the tradition. However, God does not need slaves. I no longer call you servants. I call you friends. Last September, I've been invited by my friends of Communal Liberation to take part into a meeting in La Tuile. There were many people from all over the world, from Canada, Latin America, Africa, Russia. And I heard the leader of the movement, Julian Carron, speaking. He spoke to the members of his community and to the representatives of the movement. However, he said something which was very important for me as well. He said, we cannot follow proselytism. Friendship is the right choice for us. We have to learn from each other. We have to learn everything in meeting other people. We have to trust, we have to have faith, even though meeting others can be complicated, even if we might be afraid sometimes. Metropolitan Antonij wasn't able to listen to the words by Caron, not only because he had died 10 years before, but also because this is something new for the Church, and even for the Catholic Church. Metropolitan Antonij spent basically all his life in Western Europe. He was the Exarch of the Western Europe. He represented the Orthodox Church in important meetings. He met representatives of many different churches, and he said something very important about ecumenism. Once in 1970, he took part in ecumenic meetings in France. He met many different people, and he also held a sermon in the Cathedral of Chartres. This homily wasn't only for the members of his parish. It was actually for all those who were taking part in the meeting and were mainly Catholic people. I would like to quote some passages of that homily. Our Christian communities have divided many centuries ago. We have cut our relationships and we grew further from each other. Then we started coming closer to each other, and those who were first our brothers then became our enemies. However, we were too far from each other to recognize their faces, and we weren't able to recognize the face of God in the faces of those we had grown apart from and who had grown apart from us. And so a new kind of pilgrimage started, which brought us closer once again. And now we are close enough to be able to look into each other's eyes, to look deeply into our hearts, to understand our thoughts and to appreciate what everyone does, and in recognizing the desire to follow God's will. However, we need to make a great effort, because it is very easy to only see the good in people, in the people who are part of our Christian community, who are part of our political party. However, it is very hard to be just. And the first act of justice is that of accepting the fact that every person has the right to be themselves. They have to be who they are, because every person is a creature of God. They were not created in our image. They have been created in the image of God, and so they have to become who God had wanted them to become. They do not have to adapt to our desires. And this is the fundamental act of justice, which sometimes is very dangerous. I would like to stress the fact that the Metropolitan Antonij did not pronounce these words in front of the members of his parish, who knew him very well and his ideas very well. He was telling this to people he had met for the very first time. And so it took a lot of courage to say those things. Another quotation. I am sure that every one of you has their own group of friends. But what if you had to leave your group of friends and to mix with people you don't know? This is where we have to start from. We will really understand the very essence of the encounter when we will be able to open ourselves to the other people, to love each other, to be ready to sacrifice our own lives for other people. And that will be the first step towards unity, which Christ wanted, in which he believed. And this will be the sign of the truth Christ was telling us about. And so Christ's sacrifice will finally have a meaning. Our Christian friends might know the word perikoresis, which means turning around, but also mixing with other people. Theologians use this word to describe the kind of relationships there is between the three members of the Saint Trinity. Metropolitan Anthony says that the God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit love each other so much that at one point one takes a step back, sacrifices himself, so that the other two, can reveal themselves in the fullness of the love for each other. And I believe that in Christian churches, the relationship between Christian churches has to be a perikoresis, a dance of love, so that each member who takes part in this relationship, in this movement, is ready to take a step back, so that by starting from their own tradition, they can be witnesses of God's will. And so the start of this dance of love is, in my opinion, the exhibition which brought us all together, which is dedicated to this great bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Antonij of Sourozh. That is an exhibition about the Orthodox Church in the Catholic Italy at the meeting of the Communion and Liberation Movement. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie all'amico Dima perché
Thank you so much. It was really impressive what you did, talking about this path of a meeting with a Christian that belongs to another tradition. That's a principle that was taught by Metropolitan Anthony. And talking about the prayer, Metropolitan Anthony said that the prayer is an encounter between the soul and God, but in order for the encounter to be real, both people who are participating in it must be themselves. However, he says, we are always unreal, and ourself and God is unreal for us. We think that we are addressing to God, but actually we are addressing to an image of God which was created by our imagination. We think that we are in front of Him with the truth of ourselves, but actually we are showing him somebody who is different from who we really are. When I read this, and I was last week in Oxford, I was close to the Bodleian Library, and in that library, Metropolitan Antonij had started to hold sermons to people, and people, passers-by, stopped and were impressed by that man. When I was there, I was right in that place, and I read this sentence. I understood my path, my life, my being a priest, and I thought that my life can be an open possibility of a deeper truth about myself. And I also became aware of another reality, and I was a little ashamed of that, because the biggest problem is my presumption. I think that I know God, and I think that I know Him better than I know myself. Well, and starting over a new path, as the path of which we've been hearing about, is a gift that I want to receive every day. I want Constantin now to conclude this encounter, because we only have one desire. We want to convey everything that we've heard towards a path that starts from here. I would like to express the deep emotion that we are living today when we are welcomed by young people of the CL movement here. I see your faces and I think about the girl in Paris, the girl who had received the letters from Metropolitan Antonij. Well, she is still alive, she is 90 years old, and I talk with her, and I think that this bonding, this connection between old people and new people, young people like you, well, this connection is a significant moment of what Metropolitan Antonij was thinking about, and he expressed all of these in a sentence. He says, "Go back to Galilee. After the resurrection, Jesus Christ had said, you have to go back to Galilee, because after the darkness, the resurrection took place, and Jesus wanted to go back there. So I think that our continent needs this, needs going back to its roots. This is a big experience of a great encounter between old people and young people. We have Metropolitan Antonij, who was a significant character, and he once talked about a rabbi that was living in Europe, and despite of hunger and poverty, he was thanking God every day. And somebody told him, but how can you thank God for this, because you don't have anything in your life? And the old person told him, well, you don't get anything about life. God looked at my heart and he thought, what does this man need? He needs hunger, he needs poverty, so that without anything he can stand in front of me as a man. And so that I could know him, he gave me poverty, and I'm grateful to God, because that was the way that I met him, that I met God. And today, Metropolitan Anthony is meeting us in the same way, and this gratitude, and we are experiencing this gratitude thanks to your happiness, thanks to your faces, and the way in which the movement welcomed our exhibition about Anthony really makes us glad. So thank you all.
La verità di un incontro si misura dalle
The true essence of a meeting can only be seen in the traces the encounter leaves. It can only be measured by how surprised people are, how much we feel that we have developed, and in the feeling of gratefulness we feel for having been able to take part in this encounter. Metropolitan Anthony used to say, God allowed us to meet each other. This is an unconventional way of starting an encounter, of breaking the ice. As Metropolitan Anthony used to say, when God became man, the life, the experience of every man became the possibility for God to meet each and every one of us. I would like to thank our friends Aleksandr, Sasha and Constantin, and also Dimitrij. I would like to thank them for taking part in today's encounter, and I would like to thank all the young people and adults who helped us in preparing the exhibition, because the preparation of the exhibition was an encounter itself. And all the words by Metropolitan Anthony you were reading in the exhibition, just as the words of Father Giussani can leave us unaffected. Everyone who reads these words has the possibility to grow, to learn something. Even if we look away, we have made a choice. And so I hope that everyone will make the choice of not looking away. Thank you.